Hello and good afternoon, ladies and yellow jackets out there. Wow, I am so excited to be back with you guys today. Welcome to the Fae Productions channel and today's episode of Author Reads. I am your host, Fairy Princess Lolly, and I do have a bit of a frog in my throat because, as you guys probably know, I've been sick for the last week. All of us actually have been. We missed Fae News on Wednesday because we were all terribly under the weather. And but as of yesterday and today, I'm probably at about 85%, which is making me feel much better. But there was coughing that was happening in there, and so my throat is a kind of scratchy and dry today. I hope you guys will bear with me. As per usual, please allow me to get the necessities out of the way. Please smash the like and subscribe and ring the bell button. I have a horn there, so I can be like, the bell button or something. That always helps everybody on the show as well as the channel. And of course, we love to see that you love us. So please do that, and we'll get that out of the way. And then also, today's show is sponsored by Eclectics Marketplace. And if you are not familiar with what the Eclectics Marketplace is, this is actually a compilation website. It is a resource for all things Renaissance, medieval, fantasy, Celtic, pirate, etc. So they are an index of crafters, performers, service providers, guilds, other events, and on the Eclectics Marketplace webpage, you can search through the vendors and products for the types of things that you are looking for. If you're looking for a performer, you can, look here to find them as well, or even events in your area. When events are allowed again. Actually, I would suggest looking anyway, because many events have been on the ball with getting converted to doing online activities in the wake of 2020. So if you want to become a member, if you are one of these things and you want to become a member of Eclectics Marketplace, their link is going there in the ticker. And I will have to update it, I think, in the low bar after the show. I am pretty sure that when I scheduled this show, I made a bunch of typos in the descriptor. So I might have to go back after the show and fix that. But for now, it is going there in the low bar. They normally have a $30 annual fee for that. But right now, for the pandemic, they are just wanting other vendors, performers, and whatnot to come be on their website. Add yourself to it. It's totally free to do so. And just check back with them because they are always adding new people. So it's a really great resource. And they've been really supportive of us here, so we like to be supportive back. Thank you so much, Eclectics Marketplace. And with that said, we will welcome today's author. Hello, Anne-Marie Wilson.
Hello.
Yes, how are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Good. I'm glad to hear that you're feeling better than I am. So, so please, if you will, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from, what you write. Give a shout out to any home conventions or shows that you might have.
Well, I'm born and raised in Central Arkansas. I briefly went to Missouri for college, found my husband, and brought him back. So we live in Central Arkansas now. And he's also my writing partner, but he's super shy. So I'm the one who gets to come and talk to Lolly.
So you're the face, but both of your guys' name is actually on the title of this book. So
yes. And I've lost track of what you asked. Oh, local conventions. We do like to attend VisionCon up in Springfield.
Okay.
We missed a few years while our kids were little, but we've trying to get back into going there. That's in, I believe it's going to be in May next year. They had to cancel this year. There are some in Central Arkansas, some various Comic-Cons that we sometimes attend. We haven't done it as professionals yet because this is our first novel, but we hope to have tables and meet the fans and all of that. So, and you've got our our Facebook and our website. We'll be posting all of that as things get scheduled and we show up.
Yeah, definitely. What a year to have your first book.
Yes.
You are not the first person that has found themselves in that situation. So
yeah, we've had to really focus on Facebook, which I was already on, and then we joined Instagram. And so we've been putting some things there, getting some good response. So hopefully that's something we can build on as we get to go out and meet people in person.
I confess I love Instagram. So it took me a while to get on that train, but then when I realized what that platform was about, I thought, oh, this is brilliant, and I love it. So yay, Instagram. I'm pretty sure I've gone and given you the follows over there. Everybody else should do the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about the book that we're going to hear you read from today, if you will.
Well, it's called Lethal Red Riding Hood. Let me see if I can get it on the camera.
Other direction. There you go.
There we go. Lethal Red Riding Hood. It's set in a fantasy world. It's not set in our world. And roughly Renaissance era technology. And we have our main character who is a con woman, but with a pretty decent heart underneath of it. She's had a lot of trauma in her life and doesn't trust people much. And then we have Lethal Red Riding Hood is actually the antagonist, but we also have the Inquisition is always in the background being dangerous and lurking around. And the main church, the church, is actually a goddess church. So it's structured much like you would think of the medieval Renaissance Catholic Church, but the goddess, Sariana, is actually the one goddess that everybody's supposed to worship.
A little bit of a twist there. I like it.
So, and it's the first book in what we call the Dark Goddess Chronicles, and the Dark Goddesses are the ones who are displaced by Sariana's followers coming in and taking over the old empire. So that's how they come in.
So we have some intrigue going on here. Well, so I'm curious if I can really quick before we turn it over to you, Mr. Camera Shy over there. What is his role when it comes to the writing of the book?
Well, he actually was writing professionally when we got married. I love to write stories and come up with stories, but he was that one who was actually professionally writing. He had some things published in Dungeon Magazine for D&D back in the day.
That is kind of a small world. We had a writer on here a few months ago who also had some connections in that direction. So
he had some things published there when we met, and for some other games. And so when I came in writing with him, I was just someone that we bounced ideas back and forth. Over the years, we've developed more equal partnership because I've learned more and I've done some of the stories I've written myself, some he's written. For this particular book, he was the main person who sat down and typed the story. So, and when we work together, one of us does the primary writing, so we keep a consistent voice. But there's lots of discussion beforehand. We are the first editor for each other, so we go through and we go like, yeah, we need to change this up. What are you doing here? Why did you put it that way? Is that what we discussed?
That was where I had NyQuil. I don't know.
But we both know that as you're writing the story will go in directions you didn't exactly plan. So we just trust each other enough to follow those paths, and we just as we check in regularly to make sure that we both know what's actually happening with the story.
And I think that's actually quite a cool bonding experience too, to be able to do that back and forth like that. Mm-hmm. So it's I think that I personally think writing with another individual would be quite difficult. So, but it's cool because you both are going on sort of the same adventure that
Yes.
you're writing in your own world together, and so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
All
We
right,
had fun developing the world.
yeah, and so we can expect 2 more books out of this. This is just the very first book in this trilogy, then.
Well, actually, it's a 4-book series.
4 book, okay.
Yeah, and then there's some other like novellas that we'll probably put out, like book 1.5, as it were, to help build the world. But yes, we're hoping to. The main storyline, we have it plotted out for a 4-book arc.
Aha. So you guys are, that's actually often one of the questions that people ask is, do you plot your world in advance, or are you a timeline writer, or do you sort of do the cloud world?
Well, it's a little bit of both. We know the main antagonist and the main story arc for each of the 4 books, and we know where the whole series is going, so that we can remember to build in things along the way. So it's not like we get halfway through book 4 and we have to tell you everything that's going on. But each individual book has a certain amount of, it tells us where it's going, and so we can't be too locked in to that plan in the minutiae. In fact, we've just recently thrown out the first chapter of the 2nd book because we decided that's not really how we need that book to start. So maybe that scene will come in later.
So what made you decide to choose Little Red Riding Hood as kind of the framework for the world and the story that you're telling here?
It's been so long since we hit on that, but basically it came out of the writing for the role-playing games, which after we got married, I wrote with him on that also. But one of the things that Leonard would do when he was going to pitch something to Dungeon or whoever is he would look through the monster list and he'd find something that nobody ever really uses because they think it's lame or it's difficult. And then he would come up with well, this is how I'll make it interesting. And so that he brought that mindset into the stories. And so just the Lethal Red Riding Hood sort of came out of the who thinks Little Red Riding Hood's dangerous.
Right.
So what if Little Red Riding Hood is the one that we all have to be scared of? And so that's sort of the start. And then once we got started on it, then we said, okay, let's pull out all of the folklore and fairy lore we can think of and see who we can maybe do a little bit of a call out to with the various characters. And we have a pretty big spreadsheet so we can keep track of who we've done that to. So it's not a dark telling of Little Red Riding Hood, but it's using the idea of the girl in the red cloak as a starting point for a character.
Are you guys normally, you must be fans of fantasy, fantasy fairy tales, etc., with all the D&D and, having chosen this. So.
Yeah, well, I'll read pretty much anything, but I do love fantasy. I do love folklore, fairy lore. My dad would tell me old fairy stories as he told them, which were closer to the Celtic fairy lore.
Little darker on that side there.
Yeah. And then after we got married, I found out that Leonard also enjoyed the traditional Celtic lore. So it's just, once you both like something, you read it a lot, you watch the shows that you think might address that. And so to a certain extent, we've been researching for this our whole life because we just have all of this fairy lore, folklore in our heads that we can draw on.
Well, that is very cool, and I'm excited to hear from this book today. So it's basically a combination of a couple of my favorite genres. So fairy tales and horror. So
Alrighty.
I'm excited. I'm going to turn the screen over to you. For everybody out there watching with us at home, I will be in the comments section. And if you guys have questions that you think of listening during the course of listening to Anne read, please just ask your questions, put your comments, let us know what you think, let her know that you love her stuff or whatever in the comments as we're going. And then when we're done, we will ask your questions to her so that she may answer them. And at the end of the show, we'll have a drawing for a copy of this book. So,
All right.
yes. So here you go, my lady. And I am going on mute.
Okay. So I'm going to start with reading the back cover. And then I've picked out 3 passages from in the book to sort of introduce you to the story and some of the characters. So from the back cover, Bloody Scarlet, the skull collector of the Crimson Forest, is just a cautionary tale to keep children from wandering in and getting lost. Isn't she? Well, something's out there. In a world dominated by a cruel inquisition that sees demons and witches everywhere it turns, Keeley just wants to make a dishonest living, convincing the obscenely wealthy to part with their excess riches through guile and trickery. When the Inquisition shows up to destroy her life anyway, Keeley goes on the offensive rather than scurry back into the shadows. To set it up for a fall, she lures the Inquisition into an invented race to find a heretical book of prophecy that may never have existed. When Keeley builds her lies on existing rumors, though, and points the hunt in the direction of the Crimson Forest, a new player introduces herself to the high-stakes con game as a deadly wild card. Whether or not the woman in red is the real Bloody Scarlet, the closer Keeley gets to the dark, twisted heart of the forest, the more quickly things spiral out of control. So that's the back. And now I'm going to read from the beginning where we meet Keeley. Wait, don't go. Tobias shoved his way through the crowd of revelers, struggling to keep sight of the young woman. Even if his words had reached her above the chatter and the lively airs of the musicians, though, they'd still have been drowned out by the deep, reverberating tones of the grand clock striking the hour. Tobias alternately cursed and apologized as he bumped into and dodged lords and ladies dressed in finery that would have turned every head on an ordinary occasion, but right here, right now, seemed eclipsed to Tobias by that remarkable blonde girl in the dazzling ruby gown. She riveted his attention from the moment she swept into the ballroom, and her every word and gesture had left him feeling they'd hit it off grandly. Then, bang! The clock struck 12, and she was off with nothing more than an, "Oh my, look at the time," and a hastily blown farewell kiss. Tobias hit the doors running, bursting out from the ballroom and onto a landing that overlooked the great foyer of the mansion. He heard her before he saw her, her crystalline slippers clattering against the steps of the spiraling staircase that swept down to the main floor. In her wake, she'd already left an impromptu dam of servants who'd been on their way up from the kitchen with silver trays of roasted lamb and pheasant, now all tumbled together in a horrible mess by the abruptness of her passage. "I don't even know your name," he shouted. The girl finally turned just long enough to blow him another kiss and favor Tobias with one last merry smile before disappearing out the door. He contemplated for a moment the dizzying distance to the hard marble floor below and evoked more than a few gasps of astonishment from the onlookers as he went for it. Vaulting straight over the balcony railing, the athletic young nobleman aimed for the nearest of the room's high arched windows, letting out a whoop of triumph as he caught the top of the drapes and began sliding quickly down. Then the rod holding them in place gave way on one end, and instead of sliding, Tobias found himself swinging. With a smash and a crash, he hit the window pane. Shards flew everywhere, and visions of a life about to be abruptly cut short flashed before his eyes as he lost his grip and found himself flying out into the courtyard over very thin air. Looking up at the stars glittering overhead as his momentum had its all-too-brief stomach-churning fight with gravity, Tobias had time to think, perhaps, that this was a time ready-made to wish on one of them. What he didn't have time for was to actually act on the thought before he landed flat on his back in the mansion's decorative fish pond. By the time they dragged him out and he'd recovered, of course, the girl was long gone. Tobias withdrew to his study to lick his wounds, change into some dry clothes, and escape the sudden murmurs of gossip buzzing about the master of the house had gone completely mad. As he stood before the fire, pulling on a fresh shirt and cursing himself for a fool, a knock came at the door. Your Highness, the man stammered after being bid to enter. I'm afraid she got away. Yes, thank you, Tobias muttered testily. You can go. But we may yet be able to find her, Your Highness. She seems to have lost a rather distinctive article on the front steps. Perhaps. Yes! Tobias perked up at once. What? Where is it? The visitor beckoned to a footman waiting outside. Here, Your Highness, he said, trying gamely to maintain an impassive expression as the footman held aloft the girl's ruby-red gown. The rhythmic click of crystal on cobblestone echoed through the clean, quiet streets of Cerealia outside the mansion. Quite unfazed by her newly acquired lack of gown, Keely strode confidently through the flickering lamplight in nothing but those slippers, a short, saucy white chemise, an eclectic collection of jewelry hanging from her throat and arms, and a self-satisfied grin. She'd yet to meet a soul on the streets at this hour, though the night wind did carry the clatter of a distant wagon drawing slowly nearer, and she angled off in the direction of the sound until she finally spied the cart crossing an intersection ahead of her. The farmer driving it never spared a glance in Keely's direction. He drove on, staring straight ahead, with his mind on his business, without a clue as to what he'd missed. Even when Keely ran to catch the cart, the clatter of the cart's wheels drowned out the clatter of her slippers against the cobbles, and she was able to hop onto the back undetected. As the cart rattled on through the sleeping city, an old beggar resting in the shelter of an arch just around the corner stirred in time to see Keely perched there amid the farmer's load of pumpkins, with her feet dangling off the back. Keely just grinned and winked at the man, holding a finger to her lips in a conspiratorial request for his silence, then slipped an expensive-looking bracelet off her wrist and tossed it neatly into the tin cup sitting beside him. The beggar grinned back gratefully and returned the parting wave Keely gave him before a shadow swallowed up the curious scene. Keely felt the cart jerk to a stop and realized that she dozed off, but the smell of the river and the wisps of fog drifting through the night quickly reassured her they'd come down into the market district. With that and the distinctive silhouette of the Swan Gate Bridge against the moonlit sky, she had her bearings again, even before she hopped to the ground. Landing on soft earth instead of hard cobbles, she walked away silently amidst the carts, tents, stalls, and snores of farmers who had arrived at a more reasonable hour. Though scores of people surrounded her, none stirred to notice the barely clad woman in their midst, and Keely soon left them behind on her trek toward the bridge. She'd gone halfway there before running into another waking soul, or rather, before another waking soul ran into her. At first, she thought she was about to be assaulted as he burst from a dark alley in a headlong rush, and she raised a hand instinctively to claw at him. But by the time she'd gotten her hand up, though, he'd already barreled into her, and they both went sprawling on the street. Then he scrambled away, neither attacking nor apologizing, nor paying her any mind at all. The man couldn't even be bothered to spare a glance for her wardrobe, or lack thereof. He just grabbed up his small armload of books that had scattered on the ground when they collided, and as quick as that, he was off running again. Keely dusted herself off, making a small face at how her nice chemise had been muddied, then quickly stepped off into the shadows of the doorway she'd just passed. Where a man was running like that, something was chasing him. The best she could hope was that it would be the city watch in pursuit of a burglar, and even they would surely find excuses to detain her and wind up asking awkward questions, given the state they'd find her in. She was pondering her options if it turned out to be a pack of feral dogs when the pursuit arrived. 5 riders came thundering out of the night so rapidly that she barely heard the horses' hooves striking the unpaved earth of the alley before the lead rider appeared, a shadow among shadows, as the woman's midnight black cloak whipped about her. The man riding a heartbeat behind also wore black, but alongside a brilliant crimson that left no chance of his being taken for a shadow. The moment Keely saw that flash of red, she began wishing she was dealing with those feral dogs instead. Time slowed, her heart sped up. She found herself fumbling to draw a non-existent cloak protectively around her as she sank further back into her shadowy corner. Now free of the confined space of the alley, the second rider spurred his charger forward, overtaking the woman's smaller horse by the time the last set of hooves behind them hit the cobbles of the street. A cudgel flashed out as he rode past the man with the books, connecting with a sickening crack. The echoing crack of the man's skull hitting the cobblestones sounded an instant later, no less sickening. Blood glistened off the cudgel that had struck the man down. Its wielder wheeled his charger back toward the limp form on the ground, and the books scattered about it. Keely held perfectly still, not daring so much as to breathe, lest the movement draw eyes to the lamplight, shimmering off the white of her chemise or glittering off the jewels she still wore. Only when the riders had gathered up the man and his books and ridden off into the night did she finally gasp for air and collapse to the ground in the corner where she'd hid, tears rolling down her cheeks, silent but unrestrained. With a start, Keely realized she'd been sitting there long enough for the chill of the ground to sink into her bones, though she had no memory of any time passing. Page 13, girl, she muttered to herself. Page 13. Angrily, she dried her tears with the heel of her hand, knowing as it came away with dramatic smears of the makeup she'd painted on for the ball, that her face must now resemble an artist's well-used palette. She got up and, moving a little unsteadily at first, followed the faint chattering of a fountain to its source. Perched on the fountain's edge, in the shadow of a bronze likeness of the child, Keely pulled off her blonde wig and laid it aside. As she sat unwinding the long silver braids she'd had tucked beneath, she gazed upward at the little girl who stood frozen in the act of reaching up for a large butterfly, alighting on her finger while water cascaded around them. Fluff and fairy stories, Keely told the bronze girl earnestly. That's what you are, you know. No disrespect, of course. We've got a lot in common. But while you're telling everybody you're all cuddles and comfort, the rest of you is out there sheltering this stuff behind her name. Behind your name. Whatever. It's not right. Keely had given up believing in Sariena on the horrible night that had led to the creation of Page 13, but that didn't stop her from confiding in Sariena's child aspect. It was like that night had left her anyone else to confide in. Besides, who better to share your secrets with than a girl who didn't exist? The risk of getting them blabbed about seemed pretty close to zero. Yet, for all that, a little part of Keely felt sure she had just invited terrible retribution for daring to say a word against Sariena's second aspect as the protective mother goddess. Or was that the overprotective mother goddess? Actually, Keely had come to think of the other aspect of Sariena less as the child's protective mother self than as the child's petulant, tantrum-prone evil twin. Even an imaginary evil twin could do a lot of damage with an untouchable private army at her beck and call. Keely splashed water on her face until she could no longer rub the colors off of it onto her hands. Then she finished letting her hair down and began the calming ritual of combing it out with the little tortoiseshell comb she used to pin her long braids in place under the wig. Keely was objectively aware that her face and figure were passable enough that she could bluff any man into thinking there was something special just by throwing around the right posture, props, and attitude. Despite the frequent necessity of concealing her hair, though, she didn't just accept it as adequate. She genuinely liked it. The first step in getting anyone to give you anything in life, food, shelter, a smile, a kind word, money, flowers, jewels, anything, was getting them to notice you exist. Her hair got her noticed. One overly poetic young man had even gone so far as to describe it as silky curls of liquid silver. That had been just before he'd become an overly ardent young man, and she'd broken his lute over his head. But he'd hardly been unique in where he'd chosen to begin his flattery. When Keely had finally finished combing out her hair, she stood up, straightened her chemise, and drew a deep breath. Page 16, she whispered to herself, to which she replied politely with a firm nod. There we go then, she said, flashing the bronze statue a smile as bright and winsome as any she'd flashed Prince What's-His-Name at the ball. All better, see? I told you not to worry about me. It's your other self that needs looking after. She's gone quite off her rocker. As she peered down into the dark mirror of the fountain, Keely gave herself a final inspection as best she could around the ripples. Then she climbed up gracefully and threaded her way through the cascading waters of the fountain to give the little bronze girl an affectionate kiss on the cheek. Thanks for listening. She dropped lightly back to the cobbles of the street, only slightly dampened from the experience. Oh, and she selected a glittering pendant from the jewels around her throat and tossed it into the deep waters at the foot of the statue. An offering from the Countess Camdevan, I think, Keely said as the pendant settled to the bottom amidst a scattering of small coins. We only met the once. Short woman, brown hair, dark eyes, not a great dancer. Gets really, annoyed when servants who have trouble reading her mind. You know who I mean, of course. Just count the donation as credit toward her place in the hereafter. I'm sure she needs it. Madame Ophelia sat amidst the clutter of her time-worn medicine wagon, thumbing curiously through a heavily weathered book with her equally weathered hands. The graying woman stopped short of actually reading any of the thing, not for lack of curiosity, but because she hadn't a bloody clue how. Decidedly and proudly a woman of the world, not a woman of letters, Ophelia nevertheless found it an occasional nuisance that objects such as this refused to volunteer their secrets to her. Her two daughters, having grown up accustomed to maneuvering around the clutter, somehow managed to go about the business of changing their clothes without knocking anything over and without stepping or sitting on any of the half-dozen or so cats lounging about the wagon. They carefully stowed away the fancy ball gowns they'd been wearing and were in the middle of slipping on more utilitarian wear when the door of the wagon opened. Keely climbed inside, nearly tripping over one of the cats as it scurried between her feet in a sudden rush to get outside. Ophelia looked up from her book with an exasperated sigh. Not again. Girl, that dress cost a fortune. And I'd have never been able to sell it or wear it again after a high-profile job like that, Keely countered as she carefully removed a pair of diamond earrings and dumped them onto Ophelia's book, along with an armload of glittering bracelets. There, paid for in full. The thing was an albatross. More like a calling card by now, Colette, the older of the daughters, remarked. A dark-haired young woman of about Keely's age, with a couple of decades just freshly behind her. Colette grinned mischievously as she tightened the laces of her bodice. Hey, it wasn't my idea to go crashing society parties, and those stupid gowns weren't exactly made for slipping away in. They're for making a scene in. The younger daughter, Madeline, old enough to pass for a woman, but still young enough to pass for a precocious child, snorted. If you wanted to get away unnoticed, you'd stash a dress to change into. I did the first time, and some ne'er-do-well stole it, Keely said, rolling her eyes. Besides, I thought it was my job to be distracting. You got the book, didn't you? Easy as one of those round, fruity confection thingies, Madeline grinned. You know, if you wanted to leave a calling card, Ophelia muttered, you could try leaving an X. I was fresh out of charcoal, Keely answered dryly. Or a glove, Ophelia went on, or a fan, or a kerchief. You didn't pack me any, Keely countered. Or a slipper for goss sake, Ophelia said, throwing up her hands. Oh no, Keely shot back with a real display of temper. Nobody messes with my footwear. Those are some amazing shoes, Colette sighed, wistfully admiring the crystalline slippers. You like them? Keely asked. You always find the best shoes, Colette said, shaking her head with a little smile of envy. Where did you get them? Keely just winked as she began rummaging for a dress to pull on. What about the book, she asked. Is it any different from the others? I only judge a book by its cover, Ophelia said. The binding's the same. I recognize some of the same symbols. And it's got that same cat front and center. It's a lioness, Keely corrected her. It's an angry cat, Ophelia reaffirmed hotly. But the point is, I can't read any more than you can. Aren't you the least bit curious, Keely asked, why she's willing to pay so much for this collection of books? Not really, Madeline said, taking a brush to her hair as she studied it in a hand mirror. From the gossip going on at all these parties, it's got to be some intrigue over... Hush, Ophelia cut her off. Court politics is too nasty a business for any self-respecting criminal to get caught up in, so just keep your nose clean and your curiosity to yourself. Keely finished taking off the rest of the jewelry and dumped it into Ophelia's lap before snatching up the book from her. I'll be sure to stow that away with all the other advice I've pointedly ignored. I'm ready to bet she's paying a fortune for these things for the same reason that the Inquisition is chasing them. Here now, Ophelia grabbed for the book, but not nearly fast enough to reach it before Keely pulled back out of reach. Then she did a double take. The Inquisition? Well, they rode down some poor fool with an armload of books tonight, Keely said, flipping through the pages as fruitlessly as Ophelia had. Ophelia answered with a dismissive snort. You know how many books the Inquisition has banned? A lot, Keely conceded. But the guy thought they were valuable enough to stop and pick them up after he dropped them, even with the Inquisition right behind. How much does a guy have to get paid to consider doing something that stupid? And how many other books do you think are floating around the city right now that could be worth that much to anyone? Ophelia gave Keely the wary frown of someone who suspects she's just heard a spurious argument, but can't quite nail down what was wrong with it. You've always said I had good instincts, Keely said earnestly. Trust them now. They're saying it's time to walk away from this job before we drown in it. Besides, isn't the rule that the moment the Inquisition shows up in town, we disappear? Ophelia snorted. That's the small town rule. Cerelia is always going to have someone from the Inquisition wandering around, and it's big enough to lose ourselves in. For all we know, the job's over anyway. How many books could Lady A need for her set? Ophelia said, insistently holding out a hand for the book. But when Keely's only response was a stern glare, she relented a bit. I'll sleep on it, Ophelia sighed. You do that, Keely said, tossing her the book before turning to duck back out into the night. Heck, sleep on it a couple of nights. I'm going to get started tying up my loose ends. She adjusted the borrowed dress and walked off down the street, trailing a couple of the cats who seemed to have casually decided that if she was heading that direction, it might be because there was something interesting over there. So that's our introduction to Keely. And now I'm going to read a shorter passage that will introduce our second main character, Alyssa. Belgrim Abbey stood as a graying memory of a gleaming citadel, her once proud, ivy-shrouded walls, now in that twilight state where somewhere between respectable old age and disgraceful decay. Truth be told, though, she wore her age very well indeed, considering she'd seen most other buildings in the city rise from the ashes of fallen buildings that had risen from the ashes of other fallen buildings, and so on back into the hazy distance of recorded history. It was only in the last century or two that the new round of gleaming marble edifices had begun to crowd in around her, blocking out the sun and leaving her to slouch in their shadows. The priestesses who roamed her halls could still hold their heads up with pride at the old lady's history, but the real power had moved on, and the world's eyes with it. So there was no one about to remark when an old medicine wagon rattled up to park outside her walls. Keely stepped quickly out of the wagon, once more dodging a cat as it slipped out past her feet, then another cat that had been trailing along behind the wagon, looking for an opportunity to dart inside. Keely stretched as best she could while clutching the weathered book, then crouched to scratch at the ears of the milling cats that were rubbing at her ankles. Sorry, she said, no treats today. I've had a lot on my mind, but we'll see what we can hunt down after I'm done with this. Strolling along in the shadow of the abbey walls, Keely stopped at one of the lowest spots, a simple garden wall only a couple of heads taller than herself, and leaned back against a bare patch in the ivy to wait. She whistled quietly to herself, inspecting and cleaning her nails as she waited until the abbey bells began to chime. She straightened up, turned, and sized up the wall for a moment before carefully heaving the book up and over with just enough force to clear the wall. The book landed neatly in the middle of a little gravel path through the abbey gardens. It lay there with no one around to witness it until a cat jumped up from back out in the street and peered curiously after it from the top of the wall. The little white long hair wrinkled its nose as it glanced back and forth between garden and street, then perked up its ears at the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Hey, Bookend, the slender, dark-haired young woman coming down the path greeted the cat cheerily. Nice to see you about. Did you chase all the butterflies out of the garden for me today? The girl who wore the simple sky blue robes of an abbey postulant gave an exaggerated shiver and a wink. I always appreciate that, you know. Here. She dug a scrap of bread out of the pouch on her belt. It's not much, but all the more reason to enjoy it before any of your friends show up. The cat hopped down, landing on the book on its way to sniff at the proffered morsel. What's that? The postulant blinked, doing a double take, then scowled. How could anyone leave a book just lying around in the garden? It'll ruin in no time. She dropped the scrap of bread and left it for the cat as she ran to grab up the fallen book and dust it off carefully, inspecting it for damage. And who'll catch the blame? Me, of course. Thank you again, little friend, bane of butterflies, savior of books. She smiled at the cat, then peered around for any sign that other bits of literature might have been left lying around forgotten. At last she shrugged, sighed in disgust, and started to walk on down the path. How curious, she remarked, her steps faltering for a moment as her finger traced the designs on the cover. She cracked the book open and peered inside, quickly scanning a couple of pages. Very curious. She closed the book again and hurried on, clutching it to her chest. All right. And then the last selection is, as you can see, into the story. And this is after Keely has set her plan in motion, and we have a number of important people from the kingdoms who are trying to find the heretical book that we're looking for. Down in the lowlands of the Verdmere River Valley, summer had not been kind to Didford, nor to any place remotely close to the little crossroads town. Even now, with the air cooling for a long lethargic slide into winter, the ground lay baked and barren beneath a sparse layer of withered grasses. Here and there, large patches of ground even lay black where carelessness or bad luck had lit the tender dry grasses on fire. On one particularly forlorn little hill on the outskirts of town, which offered a particularly depressing view of the sun-scorched countryside, there came a loud clang, followed by the loud report of cracking wood, followed in turn by the loud cursing of a man greatly dissatisfied with his current lot in life. At last, Clay Ampleforth, a wiry man built into solid muscle by a lifetime of laboring and presently coated in a muddy mixture of sweat and dirt, pitched aside the broken shovel handle and sank down into the shady corner of the deep hole he'd been digging, where he fell into silence. He hadn't run out of epithets. His mouth was just too dry to continue. Spying the head of the broken shovel lying just out of reach, he somehow found the will to scoot over a few inches and reach for it. With an enraged grunt, he hurled it out of the hole in a high arc, to be rewarded a couple of seconds later with the loud clang of the shovel head bouncing off a grave marker somewhere. Then Clay sat back in his corner once again and fished out a flask. He was still nursing it when a lovely young lady in pink appeared above him, peering curiously down into the hole as she held her skirts up to keep them out of the dirt. "Ah, here we go," Sabina remarked with a satisfied smile. "Could you help us find, she paused, clearly dredging her memory for a name. "Emery Ampleforth?" she finished at last. On another day, under other circumstances, Clay would likely have fallen over himself to help such an attractive and clearly wealthy young woman. Here and now, all he could offer her was a bit of a suspicious glare and a terse growl as he pointed vaguely. "Under the ash tree, third grave out from the corner." "Oh, he's dead then, is he?" Sabina asked, a frown crossing her pretty face. "Just the 3 years now," Clay muttered, only half to Sabina. I guess I'm looking for his family then, someone who knew him at least." "I've got a lot of digging to do, your ladyship," Clay said tersely, taking another slug from his flask. "Way too much digging, and a shovel to go fetch." "My friends and I are a bit pressed for time too," Sabina sighed, scattering a handful of silver coins down into the hole with a casual wave of her hand. "So I guess none of us are in the mood for niceties, are we? The Ampleforth family used to be known as the Amberfords, and the name used to command a lot of respect. I'm in a position to prove that Mad Lord Amberford wasn't so mad after all, and perhaps restore the family to its proper position. It'll be worth a lot to me to do so, so I'll make sure it's worth a lot to whoever helps me do it. I need to find out everything I can about the last years of the man's life. Where would you start looking?" In a dark corner of the thorny tankard, Clay sat alone, nursing yet another ale, and joylessly flipping a small silver coin through his fingers. He'd honestly tried to be excited, to find himself carrying around enough wealth to buy half the town, but it was a town abandoned by Sariana. The brutal summer had been preceded by a nasty winter, which had been preceded by another summer that, if not so cruel as this one, had at least been stingy and downright rude. For 2 or 3 years before that, the seasons had been just a bit callous and vaguely disappointing, but antisocial enough that they'd offered the locals no chance to hedge against the harder times now arrived. Death didn't merely stalk the land anymore. It had moved into a pleasant little cottage at the edge of town and taken up a regular seat at the local pub, where it knew everyone on a first-name basis. All of that kept Clay in steady work, digging graves, of course, but far from death leaving its relationship with him crisp and professional, it had shoved its way into his personal affairs as brazenly as it had anyone else's. Clay didn't really know anything about his great-great-great-grandfather that any church archivist couldn't have said, but he discovered 2 things inside himself that morning when the lady in pink had come calling: a profound loathing for people who thought they could buy the world, and a ready supply of tall tales. What he hadn't found in himself was enough faith in the future to care that a group of very rich, very angry young nobles would almost certainly come back looking for him. By his reckoning, he had plenty of time for a week of getting blind drunk. Then, since he had no family left himself, he'd stuff half of whatever wealth remained into the offering box for the other families the drought had devastated, and disappear in search of some place, well, not here. He was still contemplating that plan, and not yet entirely drunk, when for the second time that day, and incidentally the second time in his life, a very high-class sort of shadow loomed over him. Back already, Clay groaned inwardly. Well, it had been a good... No, it had been a life. Just a life. Whatever good fate might have intended for him had clearly been misdirected to someone else along the way. Ampleforth, is it? The man asked. I told you those were all just stories my grandfather used to tell, he muttered, not looking up. Not like I was there myself. What stories? Tobias asked, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from Clay, studying the man's face in an attempt to ascertain how much he'd had to drink. The stories, Clay stammered. The ones my grandfather used to tell. Look, sorry, he said, beginning to relax at the sight of the puzzlement on Tobias's face. Thought you were with that pretty lady who came by earlier asking about your family? Tobias asked excitedly. Clay nodded cautiously. Yes, I was afraid the witch would be farther ahead of me by now, Tobias grinned coldly. Your family wasn't easy to track down. She was a witch? Pursuing a foul quest, turning anyone who gets in her way into animals, Tobias growled. It is vitally important that I find her, to stop her and to save any of her victims that I can. Tell me quickly, what did you tell her and where has she gone? He slammed a jingling sack full of coins down on the table. Your help will not go unrewarded. Clay had gotten to feeling quite a bit less awful by the time he stumbled out of the thorny tankard and into the muggy night air. Yes, the inebriation helped, but there was more to it than that. After all, he'd gone in with every intention of drinking until he passed out, and here he was staggering along home under his own power, still coherent enough to find his way by lantern light, while singing a quiet tune to himself, even if it was a funeral dirge. He almost felt heroic, knowing now it was an evil witch he'd fed lies to before taking her money. In fact, he was sure he'd sensed it in her all along. Clever man that he was, he'd seen through the witch's disguise and sent her off on a wild goose chase, buying time for the pursuing prince to catch up and bring her to justice. Forget almost. He was a hero. What's more, he was a rich hero. He'd slain the monster and he'd walked away with his pockets bulging with silver. Better still, it was starting ever so gently to rain. Truly, it had been an unbad day. Clay was approaching the gate to the graveyard on his way past to the cottage where he slept, when he saw the human skull lying in the path. It hadn't been there when he'd headed down to the tankard, and no one but him would have had any proper business using the path between that time and this. But there it sat, neatly on the ground before the gate, like a dog waiting patiently on the stoop for some kind soul with the proper set of hands to come along and let it inside. Clay stood, scratching his head, a little corner of his drink-addled brain filling up with ghost stories. Here it was, past the witching hour, on a misty, starless night, and he found himself standing alone, face to face with a skull that had no business being there, staring into its empty eye sockets. How did those stories go again? If you weren't the hero, by the time you ran into something like this, your fate had already been sealed. If you ignored the warning, you were a fool, and whatever was lurking would cut you down. If you turned and fled, you were a coward, and whatever was lurking would chase you down. But he was the hero, wasn't he? At least for today? So what would a hero do? Clay spent a few seconds frowning down at the skull before finally turning to unlatch the gate and swing it gently open. All right then, he addressed the skull, in a voice emboldened by drink. In with you, no sense you wandering around out here all night. Whether surprisingly or unsurprisingly, the skull failed to move. Then the snort of a horse in the darkness drew Clay's attention into the graveyard, and he saw red, the bold, billowing sort of red that stands out in lantern light against a black velvet night, and screams for attention. This specific red took the form of a long, flowing cloak draped around the shoulders of what was almost certainly a woman, although the red wouldn't actually let Clay take its eyes off it long enough to explore the shadows beneath. Oh, was this yours, then? Clay asked, dry-mouthed, with a meaningful sideways glance toward the skull. Anyone standing around outside the graveyard that night would have testified they'd seen a whip lash silently out from the gates to twine around Clay's throat and drag him inward. Then they'd say they heard the lantern smash and the gates clang shut as the night went black. There being no actual witnesses to the event, all the townsfolk could say to the next important visitor who came calling for Clay Ampleforth was that he disappeared in the night, leaving behind no clue but a smashed lantern just inside the graveyard. So, and that is what I have prepared.
Well, that was actually really cool. I like how you went through and kind of picked these windows of insight into the various characters. We do have a couple questions from the
Awesome.
audience, and I have some questions as well. For all of you watching at home, while we put the questions, or while we put the questions to her, like putting the screws to you, all that medieval talk, right? Medieval talk and inquisitors, and I'm over here like, let's put the screws to her. Now is the time to put your name into the comments if you want to be entered onto the Wheel of Win for a copy of this book. Excuse me, which is Lethal Red Riding Hood. So that said, excuse me once. Okay, I do not want to do that in your ear. So one of the questions I had while listening to you read this, I was noticing how you're quite descriptive with, you're quite very well described in a lot of the things, but the food stuck out to me. And and it's funny, I never used to care about food descriptions until I read this one book on Elizabeth I, where the author was super descriptive with the food, and then suddenly I don't know, it changed my whole perspective. So now I really notice when people describe the food, and I'm wondering, do you research the food that you write about? Have you ever tried to find recipes and cook them so you know what they taste like? And if not the food, what have you, like, what is the most, I guess, interesting to you thing that you have had to research in order to write these books? This book.
Yes. I haven't specifically researched the food beyond the fact that, like I said, I will read anything. And so I've read lots of history books. I've read lots of historical fiction books. I've even read cookbooks written for fantasy worlds just because I'm fans of those worlds. So we didn't do any specific research. There may be times when we reference something that we might double check and see, is that too modern? Sometimes we'll things back and forth, but there are things that are older than most people realize, so we don't run into that too much. But mostly, we both have the philosophy to engage as many of the senses as possible when we're setting the stage and building the world, and having food and drink is one way to engage all of the senses. So for what we have had to research, let me think. Well, most of our research came after we decided whether it was, at first we went back and forth. Is it medieval? Is it Renaissance? Is it medieval? Is it Renaissance? And once we decided, yes, it was going to be Renaissance era, then we went through and we did some research to make sure what's the technology like, what are weapons like. We have a character in the book who has a blunderbuss, so we had to double check when that was developed in Italy, I believe. Things like that. So it's more just fact checking that we are era correct, sort of thing, than any sort of deep research for this particular world.
So, how do you research something that you don't know how to describe or how to Google about, right? You're building this world, and it's got all kinds of things that we never would even think we would never even think about at all, because they don't exist anymore, for example, in our time, et cetera, but they're so critical to giving the feel of that time. But how do you begin a research process when you don't even know what terms to use? You don't know what might have existed. Like, there's a vacuum potentially, I'm not saying for you necessarily, but if somebody was wanting to write and do that, how do you begin to ask the question when you don't have the words or even the knowledge of the question you should be asking?
Well, for instance, let's just say that I had decided I wanted to make sure that there was an area that was true to Spain, for example.
Okay.
It's not something that I know a super lot about. I tend to be more France, Germany, England in what I've read over the years. So let's say I want to have a region that's like Spain. I would read. I mean, I would go on to places where people recommend books and look for things that were set in that era, and use that as a jumping off point. And if there's something, and also I enjoy reading just historical books. So maybe a general history book to give me an idea of things to look for. And then when I see what other people who have researched are talking about, then if that catches my eye, then I could do more in-depth research. Is this something they just made up? Or is this something that is cool and historical that I can make my own twist on?
Nice. Okay. So let me find one of our questions here from the audience. Oh, this is one that I actually kind of wondered about too. Okay. I feel like I've missed a reference, says new, page 13, page 16. What do these references mean? This was from the very first excerpt.
Right. Well, what you'll find out as you go through is that Keeley basically has a rule book in her head where important events in her life, important things she's learned, she puts them on pages. So when she references page 13, she's pulling up a memory of a specific life lesson, as it were. And that gets explained more as you go along. It is supposed to be a little bit, what is she talking about the first time she mentions it?
Gotcha. And then it becomes clear. So one of the other questions that I have was, I had noticed, I had noticed the name of, I think it was Clay's last name was Ampleforth. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So, and I thought that was funny because Ampleforth, and there he is like drinking, right? So, and so I wondered, how do you, what is your naming convention style? How do you come up with names for things? Things, places, people.
A lot of throwing names back and forth between the two of us. That's one of the great things about being a writing team, is you can do better brainstorming than all by yourself. Yeah. And we're both big fans of writers who do clever things like that. Like, currently Terry Pratchett's very much on my brain. So we've read a lot of things where you have those sort of names that give you a certain sense. And so it's like we're steeped in that knowledge, as it were. And we both play a lot of role-playing games, and you get those sorts of names when people publish stuff because they're being a little sillier, maybe. And so it's just something we throw back and forth until a name sounds right for the character.
Okay, and so one more time, guys, get your name in the comments now if you want to be entered to win. And here we go. When you bring in horror elements, are you inspired by things that frighten yourself? And are your horror elements realistic or fantastical?
Hey, I had a little hiccup there, but I do see the question on the screen. So I don't know that it's so much things that frighten me now, but maybe things that frightened me more when I was younger. I grew up on a farm in the country, and while it was a very safe place to be, when I had to go outside after dark, when there's no, especially if there's no stars or there's very cloudy, there is really nothing deeper dark than that sort of dark when you're a kid. And so I pull more on those memories, or like, there were forests around where I grew up. And so getting in amongst the trees, especially like at dusk, sort of thing. And so it's just more about remembered things than what I'm scared of right now. And sometimes it's just where the story takes it. We have the thematic aspect of Bloody Scarlet's the skull collector, so we know there's going to be a lot of skulls involved, and then scary things develop from that.
Nice. And so I guess subsequently you would feel that your horror elements are more realistic than fantastical. Like there's not the Vug under the rug or the eldritch horror whose terrible is beyond description and would drive you insane if you were to hear it.
Right. Well, yes, no eldritch horrors, but there is magic in the world. It is a fairy tale type world, and especially with the older, deeper characters, the dark goddesses, they do have magic at their disposal. And so especially as you get into the climax, there are going to be more things that are less realistic, as the protagonists realize that the world isn't exactly what they thought it was.
Nice. Well, I really liked the sound of your book. And we are a little bit over our time here. I kind of have another question because it was just a curiosity, but I was just wondering, in the course of researching your book, have you gone to any places or physically in order to like see them, to draw upon them for either inspiration or knowledge? And if so, what is the coolest place you've gone?
Well, I have not had an opportunity to go to Europe, which would be the, that's fairy tale or European fairy tale world.
Yeah.
Our base. But it's not exactly for this book, but a few years ago, my husband and I went to New Orleans for a anniversary trip. And we were driving across the very long bridge on the edge of Lake Pontchartrain, and the skies just opened up. It poured rain, you could barely see, and driving into New Orleans, which has sort of a spooky feel.
Yeah, definitely.
With the rain and the fog and the water. As we were driving along, I told Leonard, I said, I want to remember this atmosphere for our stories, what this feels like. And then, of course, we got to explore some of these cemeteries down there, which very
creepy and cool.
Atmospheric. And so that it wasn't specifically researching for this, but we did come away with a lot of, if you want to describe things spooky, then that was a good trip to just pick up some imagery and some experiences from.
Yeah, I've been to New Orleans a few times. I can definitely concur that it is a cool place for atmospheric inspiration. So I've had a great time every time I've gone. So, okay, well, with that said, we are coming to the time now where we will do the drawing for 3 books. So let me pull up the Wheel of Win very quickly here. Yes, this is always one of the fun parts. And I saw Newton enter his name there on the YouTubes. Let me check to see if there's any other names to be added additionally. So just so you guys know, there's 2 ways to get your name on this list that you see right now. One is to be a member of our Patreon, and that will literally put you into every single drawing that we do. And also, you put your name in the comments right now, and I am adding them to the list. So I'm just gonna scroll up here and see if I see anybody. So, and I think we just have 1 extra today. So, okay, we are going to now put these onto the wheel.
Here we go.
I know, right? And this is for a copy of Lethal Red Riding Hood. Amber Wheeler, congratulations. You are the winner today. Thank you so much for being one of our Patreon patrons. We'll get in touch with you after the show in order to work out the details of getting you your awesome prize. And before I let you go today, Anne, so all of your information, I know for a fact I did not put typos of your information into Lobar. Your information is correct, uh, but there may be some typos in our show sponsor. But yes, your information is correct. It is all down there for anybody that wants to get a copy of your book. Not all of it was able to actually fit into the ticker. And so all of the links, including, the Amazon, and I think you also had a YouTube link that was in there, and all of that is in the low bar. Anybody wants to go and get your stuff. Yes, thank you so much for sharing with us. So,
Thanks,
yes, and I thank you as well. Is there anything that you'd like to say to everybody before we let you go for the afternoon?
Just thank you for letting me be here, and thank you for listening. This is a very exciting journey, first published book, and the book is for sale and also in Kindle Unlimited. So if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can check it out there.
I do indeed, but I am a bibliophile, so I always like to buy the actual book.
Yeah, me too. But
I am now at the point that I must have more space. I have to embiggen my space if I want to keep adding at the rate that I add. So, well, the last thing that I always like to say and remind folks of is, if you do go out and buy the book, please remember to leave that Amazon or, whatever, the Barnes & Noble, leave the review, because the review is very important to small press and indie authors. So help get them up in those rankings. And with that said, it's Friday. And I know I still have a frog in my throat, but I feel so much better than I did earlier this week. Thanks, guys, for bearing with me. Sunday is our next show, Handmade Home Shopping. It is 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific, and we're having a pretty good lineup getting here, coming together. And so I'm looking forward for that, to seeing that. And I think with that said, everybody enjoy your weekends and have a wonderful Friday afternoon. Bye-bye.
bye.